as I can!
I used to be pretty anti-cinematics in video games. In the past, I've spoken about how in one of my favorite games, Shadow of the Colossus, the moment where you found one of the colossi, bringing it down was a story in itself. I didn't need the cinematics to understand why Wanda was doing this, and the journey from finding the colossi to killing them, a moment that was not a cause for celebration but one of relief, tinged with sadness, was what I remembered. I didn't remember so much the weird story told in the cinematics, of Wanda becoming a colossi himself and then a horned baby, but it was the experience, the story I found myself that mattered. I realize now that though this was true for Shadow of the Colossus, or at least for me, it's not true for all games and probably not true for all gamers. I used to think games had to move away from cinematics to fulfill their true potential, especially as storytelling devices, but I'm feeling less of that now. I've worked on a number of video games, from exciting pure gameplay experiences to hugely cinematic blockbusters, and there was this as well, yeah. So I feel like I'm coming from a position where what I'm saying means at least a little something. Where I used to believe games needed to be more pure gameplay, something like Shadow of the Colossus, which I still believe is about as brilliant a game can get, I feel more now that it's simply up to the storyteller, the choices they make, the ways they choose to tell their narrative. So why do we still talk about games as being cinematic? Why do we argue about whether they can or can't be? It's sort of like how we talk about whether games can or can't be art, and they can. So let's talk about this. Uncharted, Mass Effect, Red Dead Redemption, Metal Gear Solid, Halo, Tomb Raider. These are big budget, incredibly high grossing games that borrow from and sometimes influence or even are adapted to cinema unabashedly. They utilize cutscenes that sometimes rival Hollywood in their audacity and excitement, with characters and plots that cross worlds and galaxies, examining religion, ancient worlds, the death of the Old West. They depend on cinematics, though, to tell their story. Then you have games like Portal and its sequel, or the Far Cry and Half-Life franchises, and the more recent Fallout games, through which you spend the entirety of the game seeing through your protagonist's eyes. Sometimes they'll have silent protagonists. Why did you do this, Bethesda? And in essence, these are simply games that push you into the character, putting you in their shoes. And then we have games that are almost pure gameplay, from platformers and strategy titles to ones that are heavy with hidden mythology and depth. Games that utilize a world and its surroundings to tell a story with absolute minimal cutscenes, stuff like The Witness and Journey and Company of Heroes. So, which sort of game tells the best story, which is more cinematic? The first batch with their incredible production value, vast cast of interesting characters, and far-reaching globe and sometimes universe-trotting stories, or is it the second with their more personal but sometimes still far-reaching way of allowing the player to experience story through interaction? Is the complete immersion offered by the most gameplay-heavy games actually more cinematic? Cinema, after all, is an unbroken experience. You sit in place for 2 hours or so in a dark room, silently watching it play out from beginning to end. Or does it not really matter? Here's the thing, I've seen numerous discussions over the years of what makes a game cinematic. The strive to be cinematic is something I believe is projected onto games, as opposed to actually coming from the developers. Obviously, cinema is an inspiration, and hiring actors and using techniques from cinema makes sense, but games are becoming their own thing quickly. The way film uses theatre and writing, games use the techniques of cinema. It's not as much about copying films, it's just about using lessons from them and building upon that. Recently, games for me have really come into their own as ways of telling a story, cinematically especially, if that's the way we're going to talk about it. The Last of Us felt like a real milestone in games, with a genuine complexity to its characters and a real emotional journey for those in the game, and those playing it. It was a great game, and yet people enjoyed it sometimes the way they might a movie. You could watch it without playing it and get something out of it. Was The Last of Us a success though because it felt cinematic? Or was it because they had simply used techniques that made you care? They'd learned from cinema, not stolen from it. People forget that not only was it the stuff in the cinematics that was so impressive, but the detail in the world, the animations, the interactions, the intensity of the gameplay. You could of course watch one of those YouTube videos of the cinematics all cut together, but you'd be missing so much without perhaps even realizing it. The Last of Us works because of just how good both the cinematics and gameplay are, and how they affect each other. It is hard sometimes to get away from the constant fight some games have between story and gameplay. The need to include guns in almost everything to give you something to do. The shooting sometimes being the weaker element of many games, or something you want to do more than anything as the story around it is simply half-baked, but the mechanics are there. It's hard to have a huge emotional moment supposedly affect a character after you've seen them gun down wave after wave of faceless enemies, and they should by all accounts be incredibly desensitized and probably locked up. The Last of Us and more recently Uncharted 4 found a certain rhythm, and in me a certain acceptance of utilizing cinematics heavily or actually depending on them. We still have the waves of enemies, but they fit a little more smoothly into the story, and there are enough non-violent exploration gameplay sequences to add a bit more to the adventurous experience, along with some very, very good character work. The story is genuinely well told between the action sequences, but those sequences directly affect that story. I cared about the characters making it through the violent moments because I had experienced the gentle moments. It is how I felt playing Red Dead Redemption, but with animation and performances that could match up to the design work. It really came together for me, honestly for the first time, where I wasn't having to fill in any blanks. I genuinely enjoyed the cutscenes. I wanted to sit and watch them as much as I would a movie, and as said before, doing so improved the gameplay bits and vice versa. It's interesting for me that my two favourite games of 2016, Doom and Uncharted 4, are so different in their approach, with one incredibly story-driven and one almost pure gameplay, actively pushing the story to the background, making it something you can almost completely ignore. We've also seen Metal Gear Solid move from cutscene heavy to gameplay heavy, something I thought I'd never see. It's been a very interesting time in the AAA side of things, without even talking about the subtle brilliance of something like Stardew Valley. In the end though, one way or another, they're all just telling their own stories in different ways. Often, cinematics are seen as the easiest way to tell a story in a video game. It must be hard to make a game where everything story-wise has to be experienced rather than simply shown. The gamer has to pick up notes, read writing on walls, talk to NPCs. You lose some of the potential nuance that comes from a facial expression, and the player might simply be looking the wrong way at an important moment. Cinematics mean you can guarantee the player will get the story when you want it, how you want it, provided they don't skip them, of course. I loved Gone Home and the DLC it very clearly inspired for Rise of the Tomb Raider, the way they unfolded stories gently. Small, intimate experiences, but this doesn't work for everything. Many people talk about how affecting the death of Aerith was in Final Fantasy VII. It's become a bit of a cliche now, but for me it is an important moment to discuss. There were moments that the cutscenes achieved in that game that still to this day can be studied for their power and what they did for the game around them. That sweeping shot of Midgar, it immediately sets up the world, but also the enormity of your mission. Look how freaking big this place is, and how small you are. You don't even know the actual aim of your mission yet, but you know it's going to be tough. When Aerith died too, that combination of music, of image, and the fact you'd spent so long with these characters made you want to go on harder from this point, to really fight more to the end. Seeing Aerith die from above in the standard gameplay view would have probably achieved a similar feeling, but seeing up close the helplessness of Cloud in this moment was important. Now you had a reason to fight Sephiroth. Cloud had lost a lot up to this point. Sephiroth had taken a lot from the characters, but now you had lost something. A character in your team. Control was wrestled from you, the way Aerith was. Now it was personal. I used to worry games were trying too hard to be like films. The developers felt in the shadow of cinema. But I see now that isn't the case. Games are just evolving at a phenomenal pace at the same time as developers have options they didn't have before, to tell the stories in their heads in a way befitting of their imagination. Cinematics and being cinematic are just storytelling devices. Limitations are melting away, control schemes are opening up. Performances are finally starting to feel as real in games as they do on the stage. Video games are becoming a media with which to do whatever you want. Developers are now at the point that they can tell whatever stories they want, give whatever experiences they want, create any world they want. Cinema is, and always has been, about telling stories. What I believe now is that games have reached a point where there is a level of freedom in creation and a trust in the creators, the way we have for film directors, that they have truly opened up and become a storytelling medium as powerful as cinema. Games with effective stories already existed, but it was almost in spite of the limitations put upon them. Now we've moved to a place where one of the top games of the year, one with simple but beautifully executed little interactions, was made by one person. And the AAA titles truly can compete as storytelling experiences with the blockbusters of cinema. If you put the time in now, anyone can tell a great story or give a great experience using video games. That, for me, is what we've been waiting for. It's not about games as art. It's about the tools being there to allow anyone to make the art. It's not really about whether games can or can't be cinematic. It's about whether they choose to be.
Okay.